Is Professor of History and Politics of Modern China at the University of Oxford. I asked him to explain the rise of the Communist Party of China and whether there are any similarities with today's world, like the pandemic and its economic consequences.
That's an extraordinarily interesting question, actually, because 100 years ago, of course, we were talking about the aftermath of several cataclysmic events, the First World War, and also, of course, the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, which was a very direct inspiration for the founding of the Chinese Communist Party in 1921. So in that sense, we're talking about a world in turmoil in the early 20s, which, of course, this new fledgling Chinese party emerged into. Now, what's the similarity and differences with today? Well, today, the Chinese Communist Party is nothing like a fledgling party. It's got 90 million members. It's probably the largest political party in the world, in fact. But it also, of course, is operating at a time when global order is changing. And the pandemic, of course, is the kind of global crisis that in some ways you can compare to that earlier one. Well, what difference will that make? I think that China and actually the world are going to be thinking a lot more about borders during this time. The fact is that the fast spread of the virus has meant that borders have opened and shut, often with frightening unpredictability over the last year or so. And I think that China, as much as any other country, perhaps even more so, is going to be thinking very strongly about how perhaps it operates in the virtual world in terms of its agendas, in terms of changing order, because actually physical borders between China and the rest of the world are probably going to be quite limited, relatively closed for at least a year or more to come.
What do you think has been the secret of its longevity? When you look through these decades, we've seen the end of empires, the end of kings.
Flexibility has been the key to success. So let's think about 100 years ago, the foundation of the Chinese Communist Party. What sort of party was it then? Well, it was actually a very intellectual party in many ways. It was founded really by almost all young men at that point, although some young women actually did join in later years in the mid-1920s, and that's important to remember as well. But they were inspired by Marxism, they were inspired by Russian anarchism, a whole variety of different intellectual trends at that time. And then if you fast forward to the middle of the 20th century, you're talking about the period when essentially the party becomes a war communist party. In other words, the war against the Japanese during the middle of World War II, that's a really important way of shifting the national priorities that the party thinks about. Then, of course, we get to the early period of Mao Zedong, Chairman Mao's period in power. In some ways, you could say the economic impact of that shift at that time was the influence of the Soviet Union, the command economy that looked very much from the top down towards collectivization of farms, collectivization of industry. And then fast forward again to the more contemporary era from the 1980s onwards. That is a Chinese Communist Party that talks about markets in a way that I think actually that its predecessor versions wouldn't have done in the same sort of a way. And we all know that the Chinese Communist Party has made a really important part of its shifting structure, the trying out of different sorts of market experiments in different parts of China. So you might think about South China, provinces like Guangdong, where Deng Xiaoping back in the 1980s wanted to try out special economic zones, or of course the way in which various aspects of China's economy today, including of course the consumer economy, are very, very dependent on markets. And we all know, having looked at the 5-year plan that's just been issued a few weeks ago, the consumer economy is going to be a large part of that. So in the last 100 years, there have been an awful lot of flexible adaptations and changes, even though the name of the party, of course, has stayed the same throughout that time.